Cheers.
The credits
Yeah,
thing for my patrons.
sure.
So, so you're clearly well recognized inside of the psychedelic culture as being a psychedelic author, like we mentioned at the end of the interview here. An authority on the in the modern psychedelic cultural movement. But you also have a fairly strong established relationship to the culture of extreme sports. And one of the chapters in your book was a republishing of an article from a few years ago that was published in the MAPS Bulletin about microdosing and the role microdosing has been sort of secretly playing inside of extreme sports. This question's really big, so I'm just going to let you take it however you want to take it, which is what is the relationship and presence of microdosing with extreme sports?
Well, for starters, I think my article was slightly misunderstood because I'm not really talking about microdosing in the current sense in that article. I was saying there's a line in between the truly psychedelic state. Like, I don't actually think most people do LSD really even in the psychedelic zone anymore. Like, the psychedelic zone is 300-400 mics plus. So in the 60s, one hit of acid was 300 or 400 mics, and they would give you 2 hits the first time to make sure you saw the white light. So you're talking 600 to 800 mics. If I gave somebody 600 or 800 mics the first time, my community would consider me be, reckless in this day and age. We've learned that if you dial the acid down, we can dance on it, we can talk on it, we can drive. Yes, we get really high, but we can still kind of function.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do LSD a reasonable amount, then you get used to that functionality and it becomes something else. So in the sort of 80 to 150 mic range, a lot of experienced psychedelic users discover they can ride mountain bikes or ski or do a lot of other sports. So I think what happened at the end of in the mid 70s, when psychedelic culture really disappeared out of the cities, it pretty much fled to the mountains. And in the 80s, places like Boulder and Telluride and that were some of the most psychedelic spots left in the States. And when I first arrived in the United States in the late 80s as a skier, it was very common in the 80s and 90s to take some kind of psychedelic on a powder day. And because seeing ski bums in the 80s were really kind of dropouts, you forget the greed nature of what was going on in those days. So if you actually chose not to have a career and you went off to be a bartender and just go skiing, you were pretty much considered to be a dropout. These days it's gotten a little bit more socially acceptable. But I think a lot of psychedelic culture escaped to the mountains. And then, alpine sports have been pretty much the same since the 30s all the way into the 80s. And suddenly there was an explosion of all these new ideas: snowboarding, monoboarding, mountain bikes, suspension, paragliding. A lot of that, I think, just came about from the psychedelic perspective of looking at the mountains in different ways of how to travel in them. So contemporary extreme sports culture and psychedelic culture have this very similar roots and often come from the same people and places. In Yosemite, there's lots of reports of guys climbing big walls on acid and, guys flying hang gliders in Telluride on eating big handfuls of mushrooms. I mean, all this was quite common late 70s into the 80s. And even today, I think that the mountain towns are probably some of the most psychedelic places in America, certainly on a good powder day. And the thing that if you're used to LSD and get your dosage, suddenly it actually makes you a better athlete. Like, especially in the old days in skiing, skis were quite difficult, and you're always trying to find the sweet spot, the mythical sweet spot. And you knew when you were on it because the ski just turned so easily. And you'd take acid, and it was like you're on the sweet spot all day. You couldn't fall off it. And everyone's like, oh, well, that's just your mind playing tricks on you. Well, I have skied very steep chutes on LSD, you know, and had that experience where you're doing like 15-foot drop turns on a 45, 50 degree shoot, and time's just slowed right down. It's like you got all the time in the world. No problem. Let's make a turn. Oh, let's make another turn. You know, like the sense of time is totally validated. And then you stand at the bottom of this thing and it's like, well, physics would say that if my mind was playing tricks, I should have fallen down that chute.
Right.
But I didn't. I actually just skied it really, really well. So that opens up, you know, for me, I think that was a lot of my early curiosities about psychedelics, was how are these things even possible?
Well, there's an excellent story at the end of your book where you talk about having accidentally dosed multiple hundreds of micrograms of LSD in an eyedropper and then went dirt biking through the desert. One of my favorite stories. Well, I mean, there's only a couple personal stories in the book, but I just gobbled that up. I really liked it. So when you said microdosing, then you were basically talking about what we would see now as sort of like the low end of a standard dose.
I still don't really know what I think about microdosing. Like the below 30 mic dosages, I think we need a lot more study to see what's going on.
Have you experimented with it? Like
a little bit.
10 mics?
I don't really feel the effect. Now that could just be because I'm such a hardened head as well. Like it takes a lot of LSD to do much to me. And I'm more interested in nootropics, like modafinil and things like that work better for me for that kind of thing. But I think it's really interesting. The studies that say all the Silicon Valley types give up their social media when they start microdosing, that suddenly you're not interested in Facebook and stuff. That's really interesting. There's definitely a lot of really interesting concepts in there. I may experiment with it when I get to work on the novel. But I think my article was a little bit misunderstood, but it has been seized on by the microdose movement. I believe it's this, like the second most distributed microdose, related article. It's been repaired in Russian. And last year, the New York Times quoted me saying, James Oroc says the best time to do LSD is for breakfast. So I was quite proud of that. Advice
put that one on your resume, man.
Yeah, advice I've been giving people for like 30 years. So